conversation is going to be a ton of fun. We have, let's start all the way down at the end. We've got John Keefe, who is a bot developer and product manager at Quartz. Next to John, we've got Mark Male, who is at Havas Cognitive, where he is the global director. And his focus there is on products and services using data and cognitive services. Francesco Marconi is next. Francesco is strategy manager at the Associated Press, and there he's the co-lead on automation. AP has been a leader along with Bloomberg in using automated writing for news. And then finally, we've got Missy Kelly, who is product design director at Huge, where she is in charge of putting AI into client products to make them more intelligent. And I'm really excited to talk to all of you about bots, the good, bad, and the ugly. So I thought we could start with some definitions. So often, if I'm at a cocktail party and I say, I'm working on bot stuff, people will say, oh, what's that? But I thought we could start with some negative definitions. What is a bot not? Okay.
First, that's a terrible cocktail party. I would probably slowly back out of that.
That would be fine, by the way.
I would probably, so you want to talk about the good, bad, and the ugly. Right now, I would probably go with, a bot is not useful in a lot of applications.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm going to be provocative. That's terrible. Because I feel like the percentage of bots that are out there just to be bots.
Okay. Great.
All right. Wow. All right. So a negative definition of what a bot is. I think a bad bot doesn't allow for efficiencies or differentiation in something that you're actually doing within a newsroom setting, in my case.
Okay, great.
I think a bot is it's a means to communicate, but it's not an end-all, be-all means to communicate.
Great.
I think a bot is not yet been figured out that's really great for news. That's what I think.
Interesting. Well, John, you're actually a great person to ask. How have bots been useful for you in news and in the newsroom?
At Quartz, so we've just started a bot studio, and I'm one of the initial people in the bot studio, and there are a lot of folks in Quartz who sort of work in this studio, and the idea is to explore bots for news and information. So we're just sort of getting underway, but for a year, Quartz has had an app that is bot-like, and I go out of my way to point out that what's in the app is actually written by humans, and they're amazing, wonderful humans who write very, very well. And so our experience so far is that people appreciate a conversational interface, and so that's what we're looking at, a lot of different conversational interfaces, whether they're automatic or not. And so I think so far what we've learned is that people like that, but it's not just the botness that they like. They like the writing, and they like the voice, and they like the utility plus the entertainment.
Right. So a bot is not a computer program that writes its own copy.
Well, certainly could be.
All right.
I mean, I sort of classify bots in our world in a couple of different ways. One is something that it's a repetitive task that a human could do, maybe has done, and writing stories is certainly one of them. The New York Times in the last election wrote a story about every single race in the country, except nobody actually wrote all of those stories. A bot wrote those stories, right? So that's one kind of bot, or a tool that keeps track of something for you. But then the other kind of bot that we're really playing with are bots that you can talk to. So either bot that you type to, like a chat bot or a text bot, or a bot that you talk to, like Alexa or Google Home.
Great. And Francesco, can you talk a little bit about how the AP is using bots?
Yeah, absolutely. So our definition of bots is a little different. So we are looking at essentially two major categories, bots for automation and bots for augmentation. So as John touched a little bit on the bots for automation, which is essentially allowing you to do a repetitive task at scale. Specifically, news coverage on topics that have, a certain formula to it. We are currently automating financial stories, so they are very data-driven, and you can easily create a template and essentially fill in the data and generate a text that looks like a human wrote it, as well as any other forms of stories that have data at its foundation. Sports are an example of it, as well as any sort of economic indicator. On the other spectrum, you have this idea of augmentation, which is to use cognitive technologies or artificial intelligence, to provide a different perspective to a data set, or to provide a different perspective to a story. Essentially, these things are anything from sentiment detection, machine learning to find hidden patterns within data sets. And the goal here is to essentially provide reference points that allow reporters to do more differentiated work.
Great, so that's how bots are being used in the newsroom. How are bots being used by brands? Missy and Mark.
Sure. I'm loving when you're saying augmentation. I think for you, you're looking at augmentation of data sets. For us at Huge, what we're doing and what we're trying to do when we approach our brands is not just apply a conversational interface. You can kind of do that. Everybody's doing that. Anybody, you can walk on the street right now, walk into a store and talk to a shoe through a text message. I mean, that exists, right? What we're trying to do is approach it in what is the goal? What is the goal of this brand? And then how do we use the technology to achieve that goal? And where I keep landing is the augmentation of the humans. Mm-hmm. So we're working on a really large client right now who they want, like most clients, want to automate everything. And we say, well, okay, sure, we'll automate some stuff, fine. However, one of the biggest things that you have to offer is this very high touch service. So how do we automate things on the back end so that we can facilitate this high touch service? And that's where we start to use bots, and that's where we start to use the augmentation. Like, use the machine learning so that we can make the people have more enriched touch points with their people. And every time I communicate with you, if I only have 1 minute today to communicate with you, I'm going to use ML to make machine learning to make sure that that communication is efficient. Not the process of communication, but our communication. Efficient, rich, valuable. And so, that's what we're bringing, which I think is a really compelling place in a sea. So when I go back to bots not being useful, in a sea of people saying, how can someone talk to my brand? I'm going to give them an app, and they can download it and chat with Nike or chat with Unilever. Because you got those questions about Windex, we look at it different. we look at it, how can we make it richer and achieve your goal in really smart ways? It's a really long answer.
Great.
Yeah, I totally agree with Missy. There has to be a business goal. I think as an agency, one of the most frustrating things is if you get an ask from a client or a brief that says, we need a bot. It's hold on, there's a chance actually you don't. You might. And we'll give you that answer if that's a thing. But when you really think about the space, is there's kind of the rule-based bots, which are kind of FAQs, and I think those are great uses of bots. Is it's answering a series of questions. I think on the more complex side, when you start to get into machine learning and AI and bots that can actually give a personal experience to the user based on things about that human being, I think those are also really interesting. And I think Missy actually said this in the back, which is you shouldn't think of these things as a technology. They're an interface, right? And I think we always talk about having these types of solutions on platforms that your consumers are already on. So don't make them go somewhere else. If they're on Facebook Messenger, and a bot is what you need, then we're going to have a plan to put it on Facebook Messenger. But maybe it's also going to be on SMS, or Kik or whatever it is, right? So I think figuring out what the business case is and which experience is best suited for that one business case is usually where you want to start.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think that's exactly it. As you are designing your automation strategy, the most important thing is to keep in mind what are you trying to accomplish. For the Associated Press specifically, there are essentially two goals. One is to free up resources, so those journalists that are essentially doing a lot of data crunching work can now be free to investigate stories, develop new multimedia formats, develop sources, and actually differentiate the report. So it's not only about volume of content that you are able to create, but it's also about differentiation. Just as a stat on this, so we were able to save about 20% of journalists' time working specifically on financial earnings reports. And we increased our production or our coverage. We went from covering about 400 companies to 4,000 companies. So there's both quantity but also differentiation.
So what are some examples of platforms where you've seen useful bots implemented? So I'm reminded of what Chris Wiggins said in the previous panel about how the New York Times is using Slack bots, embedding bots in their company Slack channels in order to make editors' lives a little bit easier. And Mark, you just brought up Facebook Messenger bots. So what are the platforms and what are the interesting uses of bots on those platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we use Slack bots internally. We built one just to literally look people up. We're a 20,000 person organization, and that's a lot of people. And I might not know that a different employee within my network has experience working on a sports brand. And if I can just ask in Slack, does anybody have experience working on a sports brand? And it automatically tells me here are 10 people in your office. That's much faster than me sending an email to 50 people and maybe getting a couple of responses with the right thing. So I think the platform, in my mind, depends on what the use case is. Facebook Messenger in Office might not necessarily work for me, but I know Slack will. I think, what the Times did actually during the elections, which was actually what I really consider a visually driven chatbot experience, which I would ask Facebook Messenger X about the elections, and it didn't just give me, here's an article to go read. It gave me little infographics about kind of live stats. And I think that's actually a really beautiful way to interact with, a news article and also a brand. I think of the New York Times as being an innovative brand because they are doing those things. Similarly, I think, voice as interface, the Echoes and the Google Homes of the world, there are very good use cases, I think, for those things. They each have kind of their benefits and the different things that they as brands want to get out of those platforms. Amazon wants you to buy product with Echo. That's, at the end of the day. And if, Google, they want your data, right? And so I think they each have different use cases. Thus, you can get different experiences based on those things. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve.
I'd like to, pun intended, echo what you just said. I think Amazon Echo is probably one of the best examples of a platform, not because you're able to get all the answers, but because in one fell swoop, where Apple kind of failed, they introduced this idea of artificial intelligence and made it so humanized that people started to forgive privacy issues. They started to forgive data collection so that they could ask for a song from Spotify to a can. They could say, "Dear can, please put gummy bears on my shopping list." And then if you were to go to the Amazon app, you would see that gummy bears are now on your shopping list. You can argue how well she works and, what the NLP is up one way and down the other. but no piece of technology that I've encountered in the last however long has drastically just shook the way people engage since the iPhone. Has shook since the way people engage with a piece of technology. People are now comfortable talking to appliances. Mm-hmm. That's something that we're just like, oh, my mom has an Echo. Like, what the hell is that? You know? It's great. I think Amazon's done an amazing job.
I've actually always talked to my appliances, except it's usually that I'm like shouting at them for not working.
Damn it, dishwasher.
Yeah.
There's two things I would say about that. One, on the echoing Echo. If you have any doubts about the future of a voice interface, watch a child work with the Amazon Echo and Alexa. There's no friction. They get it right away. There's no issue. And I would just mention that Slack is an amazing interface obviously for communicating, but also for making bots and getting information into and out of the platform. And it also happens to be what I think most journalists these days are using. It happens to be. And we have a grant from the Knight Foundation to work in the bot studio. And one of the things that we're doing at Quartz, in addition to building bots for our own journalists in Slack, our mandate is to share that out to y'all, to the public. So we are actually going to be sharing journalist-based tools and conversational bots, and sometimes just utility bots that are Slack-based. And we're going to be we're developing those all summer, and going to, we hope, announce them at ONA in DC in the fall. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be sharing it out.
Great. So Slack, Echo, Messenger. Francesco,
Yeah, I'll
platforms?
triple echo the echo. So
We have fans up here.
in terms of tools for our newsroom, we've been experimenting with a few things with the Echo. One of them is the ability to query really large data sets. So, for example, if a journalist is doing research on real estate pricing in a very specific location, it's easier to ask the Echo for those numbers rather than just going through a huge spreadsheet and try their luck. A second thing that we experimenting, it's actually inspired on one of the projects that John's student developed, which is applying the Stylebook, which is essentially the guide of how you should write in terms of using the AP style. And it's the ability to ask Amazon Echo, how do you spell something, or how do you use punctuation in a certain sentence. So those are sort of the two big experiments in terms of newsroom tools using conversational interfaces.
Cool. So an AP style bot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I like that.
Trademark that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned using bots to deal with large data sets. And I want to talk about big data in general, because one of the things about big data is it's very exciting, but it's very unwieldy, right? Like it's big. And I think of big data as being like a grand piano. You kind of want to put it in one spot and fine tune things and then not move it, right? Because like then you have to optimize it all over again and it's a huge pain. So that's one of the drawbacks to big data. And I wanted to talk about what are the resource challenges that people need to be aware of when they are developing bots. So what kind of staff do you need? What kinds of resources do you need in the big data world? Like it's very expensive to house a lot of data. What are the kind of financial pitfalls around developing bots?
Oh, can I jump on that?
Go for it.
Thanks. What is happening more often than not is people, so we go to our clients all the time and we say we have this really beautiful plan. This is how we're going to get into a digital transformation, whatever. And they're like, great, here's our IT staff. They're going to support you. And we're like, amazing. So where's your experienced designers? And they're like, well, we don't have them. But you have our IT, we're good. You have your engineers. I think some of the biggest pitfalls is thinking that it's a technology problem and not an experience problem. That is where you end up with bots that don't perform well, machine learning that doesn't consider what that data experience is on the other side. So the biases that happen, not thinking about, is my data set diverse enough that I'm thinking of enough people, enough scenarios, enough personas. So having that experience designer, the UX designer present, having a data scientist, that it seems like a no-brainer. But a lot of times we sit down and we say, yeah, where's the data scientists? And there just are none. And that is like a big loss. And so a lot of what we do at Huge is in that first phase and interacting with our clients is really like educating them on, you're about to automate something. What is the experience on the other side of it? How do you maintain a positive experience for everyone involved? Because it's now you're in an ongoing relationship with your data. It's not a set it and forget it kind of situation. So what does that relationship look like with you and your data moving forward? And how are you going to staff up for that and build the iterative cycles into that?
Yeah, I think my first comment would be just around like the term big data. I actually think the reality is most people in this room, unless somebody here is from the NSA or maybe Google, I actually think most of us are probably working in like medium data, and that's still challenging. And I think from like a staff perspective, there's kind of, having people who speak the same language, especially on the client side, who understands the pitfalls of some of the nomenclature that's out there in the world. And I think we have to remember the concept of like a brand voice. You need experience designers, you need writers. I think writers that are, scared that the bots are coming for their jobs, they actually just have to think about it more in a way that is like, you are now the steward of teaching this thing how to speak like you would. And I think that's bots that I've seen have problems actually don't have the right brand voice. And it could be as simple as if your brand says hello, or if your brand says, hey, what's up? That's representative of your brand through the bot. And I think from a staffing perspective, those are the types of things that we need to think about. It's like the brand voice, it's the experience design, it is the data science, it is the tech, and it's also a willingness of prototyping and agile development. And some clients can do it, and some clients, say they can, but they at the end of the day can't, and that's okay. And we just have to support that.
I would just say that at the individual journalist level, right? So you're working on a story. Maybe you're not at a Bloomberg or New York Times where you can walk over to the data scientists and talk to them about it. I kind of equate it to Google Maps, right? It used to be not that long ago, like 7 years ago, that in order to put a map on a website or in a newspaper, you needed a $10,000 program, and you needed data from the place you were going to map. So if it was, Australia, you needed the data from Australia. You had to download that. Now, literally with a one line in a browser, you can get a map of anywhere in the world, right? That is big, huge data, and it's not on your computer. The same is happening with AI, and that's why this is actually fueling the bots, but also fueling journalism. I can, with a $35 Raspberry Pi with very little memory on it, take a picture of this audience, and I did this just last week, and send it to the Google Vision API, and it will tell me what it sees. I don't need to have that artificial intelligence on my computer. I just need to have subscribed, which turns out to be free if you're not going to use it very much, to the Google Vision API. And this is the thing that I think, especially, again, at this sort of individual journalist level, this is where AI is going to start to be able to be available. It is now available to you for your projects as you're starting to think about, how do I tackle this issue? And, oh yeah, I don't have a whole bunch of data scientists down the hallway to solve it. So I think that the door to big data is opening more and more, especially in this AI world.
Yeah, I think it raises a related question, which is should you build or should you partner when you're trying to develop something? For the AP specifically, we've been very successful at collaborating with either startups or universities to develop new technology. So when we first starting to look into automation and artificial intelligence, we identified a small startup that at the time was based in North Carolina called Automated Insights, and we worked in collaboration with them to build these templates that later on enabled us to automate a lot of stories. Right now we are doing a project with MIT Media Lab, just going through huge amounts of Twitter data and trying to identify specific insights that can inspire a story. And so I think as costs of technology are going down, as John mentioned, with the emergence of Google Cloud and Microsoft Cognitive Services and IBM Watson, AI in cognitive computing becomes much more accessible. That doesn't mean that you don't need to have those skills in-house. We recently formed what we call an automation committee, and essentially 5 people from different parts of the organization, product, editorial, strategy, sales, that are just looking at opportunities to automate or to augment either processes or content across the board at the AP. So those people, the expertise of those people is that they are able to understand bots in technology, but they're also able to translate it back in layman's terms to their teams. I think that's crucial. Specifically on the data science expertise, we have a person whose title is automation editor, and he's a journalist with a tech background, and his job is just to make sure that all of these automated systems that we have in place work. And something that you mentioned is that when we are talking about automation and AI, it's not about set and forget it, the robot will do everything for you. There's a lot of maintenance that goes into maintaining these systems. Just a very small example, when we are automating stories, financial stories, and the headquarters of a company changes, there needs to be someone that goes into the system and says, the company is no longer headquartered in New York, now it's in California. So there's a lot of maintenance that goes into that, and we should all be paying attention to how does AI impact the processes that we have in place.
So it sounds like putting a bot or putting an automated process in place inside a company is a lot like getting a pet. Like there are a lot of ongoing responsibilities associated with it that you perhaps don't realize. And there's also a lot of expenses that one doesn't realize. So I want to go back to the project you mentioned about finding insights in Twitter data, because Twitter has been the location of one of the most commonly talked about controversies related to bots. So when Microsoft built Tay, the chatbot, and released it on Twitter, Twitter users sent a whole bunch of hate speech at it, and it quickly became a racist bot. So let's talk about Tay, and let's also talk about Pitfalls with chatbots.
Rest in peace, Tay. That is, if the moment you let anything out into the wild, people will destroy it. People will find the weakness and absolutely destroy it. And there's kind of like no two ways about it. It almost leans on you're there grooming. So Tay would be a good example of it's sent out into the wild, a set it and forget it kind of situation, with not the pruning and grooming of like a bonsai tree to make sure you didn't, on the other side, end up with what Tay ended up being. Let us not speak of it. But I think when Yeah, I lost my thought. There we go. Lost it. Lost
All
it.
right.
I started thinking about what happened with Tay, and there was another Korean bot that also went down that way. And there's a sense of hopelessness of as soon as you open it up, you've let the bird leave the nest, and unless you're constantly coddling it, you're kind of left with what monster comes out of it.
Yeah, and I think that raises the question of algorithmic bias. So at the end of the day, these systems are developed by humans, and humans make mistakes. So one thing that we should all be aware is that at the end of the day, it's a human decision behind all automated systems. And it can produce really bad results like they, or it can produce really good results like freeing up journalists to do more meaningful work. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like data in is experience out. So, you have to be able to put some of the rules in place to mitigate things like that. And I think there is the harsh reality of when you do something on a platform like Twitter and Facebook, and you're a brand that's doing kind of a technological experiment. You kind of have to mitigate the fact that like people are going to try to break it and fuck with it. Mm-hmm. Like that just is kind of the reality, because there are developers and people out there that's what they thrive on doing, and that's what kind of excites them. So I think I think the flip side is you need to be able to take some risk as a brand, and you need to be able to try platforms that are innovative and try platforms that are where your consumers are going, if not now, maybe in 6 months or a year. You need to do it with the understanding that things at some point could go sideways. But I think as good partners, whether you're a technical partner, an agency partner, you just have to do as much as you can to mitigate the risk. And put whatever rules in place, either from an experience perspective, a data perspective, a technical perspective, or even just a moderation perspective, to try to prevent that from happening.
There is a great story that a colleague of mine, Leah Fessler, wrote in Quartz about how people abuse bots. And it becomes a particular problem with all of these talk-to bots, Google Home, Alexa, Siri, all women voices, right? And so so she did this story where systematically saw how these bots dealt with basically sexual verbal abuse and how they respond. And what was really interesting about this is that in most of the cases, and she did this very methodically, most of the cases, they did not react like negatively, like that's not appropriate. Or sometimes it was even, thank you. Or, oh, that's, you shouldn't, there wasn't even like, you shouldn't talk like that. So it becomes this other level where, what is a bot maker's responsibility to say, oh, wait, we're going to call that out in addition to handling it. Right. And especially when you have this whole gendered situation that we have with these, bots that we command that have female voices. And I thought it was just an amazing, definitely take a look at the story, amazing sort of picking apart of where the ethics and responsibilities lie, not only in the user, which we can expect is going to be to some degree abusive, but then how do we react to that?
Right. I mean, if I could jump in really quick, I mean, this is the easy, this is kind of like the easy crutch for that, but it's diversifying who's building these things. So an example is we built a platform and are building a platform within Huge that is essentially like our business's API. And we've thrown a ton of interfaces at it. There's a Slack bot, there's a chat bot, but there are a lot of like backstage processes. And one of the things that came out when we were defining what are some of the types of interactions we want to support, what are the scenarios that we want to support, and one of the really easy ones was, what's my PTO? What's my time off? How much do I have? Because in order for us to get it right now, it's just this convoluted mess. And in conversations with just my engineering team, it was a very easy query. What is my PTO? You get a response back. In my conversations with my engineering team, and my experience designers, it was, what's my PTO? And the response that came back were, this is your time off, and these are school holidays. Because a lot of our staff, our women are the ones that take the days off. And so having context of when your school holidays are to how much PTO, it gives you a little insight of how, what's the flexibility of the time I can take off. It's just diversifying that team. And then you get somebody in the room that says, hey, well, what happens when, somebody calls Alexa a slut? Somebody in that room is going to be like, well, let me tell you what I would say, But you kind of don't have that voice in that space right now.
I'm reminded of a time that I was with some parents, and there was little kids who were playing with Siri, and they were yelling at Siri and like being really abusive to Siri in like a little kid kind of way, like 4 or 5 year old kind of way, and the moms stopped them because they were like, listen, you don't talk to people like that. Yeah. And they felt like, teaching the kids not to treat Siri like that was equivalent to teaching the kids not to treat people like that. Absolutely. Which was really, really interesting to me.
This is a great article that is, Alexa is great. She's turning my child into an asshole.
Yeah.
And part of the problem, and the end of the blog post was that the author was suggesting a kid mode where you actually have to say please before Alexa will respond. And you can actually, by the way, say please, and Alexa will work. And then also say thank you before accepting any other commands. So that would be sort of the kid mode. But you can actually model that yourself if you're a parent at home. You can say, Alexa, please tell me the weather, and it will actually work. So.
Yeah, it's funny because I have a 4-year-old, and he will sit with Google Home and ask Google Home questions, but I've kind of, to a degree, have explained to him that like he does need to be polite, mostly just because that's how Google Home understands him better, because he is a 4-year-old. So like he does say thank you to Google Home. He doesn't even say thank you to me, and like I'm his dad. And it's like but Google Home has a response, right? It says, "You're welcome. Have a great day." Like so like he is kind of interacting it in a different way. I mean, Siri's been around, for a long time now, and I think within days of Siri coming out, there was a whole Tumblr feed. I think it was like shit Siri says at Tumblr, and it's like it was all just people testing Siri and basically feeding it inappropriate things just to see what would happen. I mean, that was within days of Siri coming out.
Does Siri not tell you where you can get an abortion?
I don't know.
I do not know the answer to that.
I feel like I read something.
You could probably find out pretty quickly.
So there are a lot of human decisions embedded in bots, and there are value decisions embedded in technology. So I remember a few years ago, Nick Diakopoulos did some work on figuring out what are the bad words that Google won't respond to. How do you guys deal with bad words, or deal with cursing, or deal with kind of socially verboten subjects when you're designing technology?
I think I've probably cursed like 5 times just from being on stage. So again, I think it just goes back to brand voice. Like, it really depends on who you're working with. Like, I can't think of any brands that would overtly want you to curse or be inappropriate, but having maybe certain slang or nomenclature be built into the experience might be representative of some brands. So I think you want to be able to understand that before you create one of these experiences.
Absolutely. I mean, Huge as a brand we're known as, if you don't know who we are, we're the hipster brand. I'll go out and say that, we're the cool brand. And for our bot, I mean, you can curse up one way and down the other, and she comes right back at you because we've on the back. I mean, you can ask her what the fox says, and she tells you. I mean, it's just a brand voice.
What does the fox say?
I don't know.
All right, fair enough.
I don't know.
So let's switch gears and let's talk about political bots because this has been much in the news lately. And I don't know. Let me just throw it out there. Political bots. What's great about them? What are the dangers?
Look to you guys first.
Yeah.
We all looked down.
You look at us.
We're like, AP, quartz?
Yeah.
So I can start. So specifically, AP doesn't have a bot for politics or actually for direct news distribution. But what we have been trying to do and develop is essentially APIs to ping, our data sets of election results, so other companies can build their products. So that's the extent of our experience within political bots. And I think you use AP data for your bots, right?
Yeah, we've been experimenting with the AP stuff. I think in terms of what do you mean by political bots? Do you mean political bots like something like the New York Times did during the election? Or are you talking about bots, spam bots that are out there trying to sway an election? I mean, what are we talking about?
I think both. So, for example, I have built bots to help reporters keep track of campaign finance filings for candidates that they're particularly interested in. Like it'll be, you say, all right, I want to follow this politician, and then whenever their campaign or somebody associated with their campaign files with the FEC, you get an alert in a Slack channel saying, hey, this is there. So that's very useful for your workflow. If you're not a campaign finance reporter, it's totally useless to you. But political, there are bots, like bot armies, for example, who will amplify certain politicians' speech or attempt to drown out speech that is counter to a particular regime. So I think that's one of the dangers of the bot world. I wonder if you could talk about it.
I think with any emerging technology, you're always going to have kind of both sides of the fence. You're going to have the experiences that are going to benefit society and benefit people in the way that they interact with other people or brands and things like that. But then unfortunately, you're going to have the other side of the world, which is messed up things that they want to exploit within those technologies. There's a chatbot out now, ResistBot, which you can text at it or chat with it, and it sends a fax to a congressman, with your point of view. That's obviously on the side for good. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's probably a chatbot that does literally the opposite, that prevents free speech, for example, whatever it is, right? And so I think the reality is we unfortunately live in a society that that's always going to happen. There's probably not a ton we can do about it because we do want the technology to be out there in the world so that at least we can benefit on the positive side.
There was a really interesting piece this morning on WMIC, and they were talking about fake news and chatbots that were spreading fake news on Twitter and whether or not that was covered by the First Amendment. And the opinion was that yes, because once you say, no, this is deemed fake and you cannot say this, it's a slippery slope. So you have to say, okay, this needs to be allowed. But you have to think to what degree, especially on Twitter, I think Twitter is just becoming a touch of a cesspool of bad data, right? Think about Tay, right? We go back to Tay, poor Tay, rest in peace, is a bot that's being informed by potentially loads of other bots. So now we have this army of terrible bots that are creating cacophonies of terrible bot data, only making them worse bots, and then you happen to comment on one of them and you reply, no, you're terrible for saying these things, and then the bot army flocks on you. If that doesn't paint like the worst picture ever, but really, it starts to point at you. Now all bots on you. It's a very strange world, and it starts to. I think Twitter specifically is feeling the pinch by these types of bots, these types of troll bots, right, if you will. I mean, it used to be they were regulated to the comment section.
Right.
I would say in terms of the campaign finance tracking and stuff like the thing you made, I just give a shout out to friends at ProPublica who built the election data bot still operating. If you're following a congressional campaign, you can follow that, and it will send you alerts in the same vein that you're talking about. It uses some machine learning for that as well. And then I would just sort of, I mean, so much of the internet. Remember, the internet is evil. The hack on Podesta, right? The hack was not done by a bot. You know what? It was done via this really scary interface called email, right? That's how John Podesta's emails were hacked into, right? As phishing, as spear phishing thing. So all of this technology that we use every day can be used in nefarious ways, clearly. How we educate ourselves, how we know about them, how we go about trying to distinguish between Twitter bots, which you probably can identify when a Twitter bot starts following you. You can see that, right? So there are ways there are machine learning ways of identifying, just like we identify spam and phishing attacks, spam bots. There are Twitter bots. So I think that this is always going to be a push and pull with technology. Everything from email to Twitter to Facebook, we're going to have to deal with that and wrestle with it. I don't know that there's an easy answer, but I kind of push back on folks who say, the bot apocalypse is upon us. I'm like, I'm not too sure about that yet. I could be naive.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much for coming to us.